All right, very good.
Good afternoon, everyone. Whoa, loud. My name is Madison Fossa, and I'm a fellow with the Institute for Faith and Freedom. It is my honor to introduce today Dr. Paul Kengor. Dr. Kengor is a professor of political science here at Grove City College and a New York Times best-selling author of over 20 books. He is the executive director at the Institute for Faith and Freedom. His articles have appeared in publications from The Washington Post and USA Today to The Wall Street Journal and The New York Times. He is a longtime columnist for the American Spectator and was named editor-in-chief of the magazine in September of 2022. He is an internationally recognized authority on several subjects, particularly Ronald Reagan, the Cold War and communism, and the American presidency. Kengor is a frequent public speaker at venues such as the Ronald Reagan Library, the Reagan Ranch Center, National Press Club, Heritage Foundation, American Enterprise Institute, and many more. Kengor received his doctorate from the University of Pittsburgh's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs and his master's degree from the American University School of International Service. He holds an honorary doctorate from Franciscan University. He and his wife Susan have 8 children, 2 of which are adopted. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kengor.
Thanks, Madison. She was one of our interns at the American Spectator last summer. And if you go there and look at her article archive, so Madison Fossa, F-O-S-S-A, she was doing probably 3 or 4 articles a week. So she was really, really prolific, really, really impressive. I'm ditching my jacket for this because it's hot. I was already sweating. And then stupidly, I just went over and did the rowing machine for 25 minutes. Right? Which is, you could have done a dumber thing than that. So I gotta try to stop the flow of sweat here. So I'm dropping the jacket. So, all right, so my topic today, the American founders and slavery, right? And I think on the 250th anniversary of 1776, this is something, I think everybody should know this. I think everybody in public schools, first of all, they ought to properly understand Marxism, they ought to properly understand socialism, and they ought to properly understand the American founding. And that includes the true story of what happened with the founders and slavery. Some of it's bad. I could probably call this the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? But a lot of it, I think most of it is not understood, especially by the people of, the whole 1619 project, right? And, slavery has been called America's original sin. And, no doubt it was a sin, it was an evil, it was pernicious, it's a stain on our country's history. But the truth about it and why they didn't end it in 1776, why it had to wait until the Civil War, 1860s, 1865, I think you'll learn some of that here today. All right, so I have a PowerPoint that I put together. My source, a little shameless plug here for my book that's available outside, but I did a book in 2023 on the church and slavery, and it was requested by Emmaus Road Publishing in 2020, the evil summer of 2020 that I did this book just to show where the church really was on the issue of slavery. So what I'm taking here today comes mainly from chapter 3 of that book, Slavery and Abolition in America. So if you're looking for exact sources on my material, footnotes, and additional details, you can find it there. All right. Start with George Washington. So he is the father of our country, born in 1732, died in 1799, and he was, of course, the hero of the American Revolution. We've heard a lot about him today. Michael Medved in his The American Miracle talks about Washington with some great material on Washington and slavery. He pulled off a stunning victory against the British Empire as head of the Continental Congress, as commander-in-chief, essentially, before there was an official presidential commander-in-chief. What he did was so extraordinary that the Continental Congress, others went on the record saying that they believed that this was the work of Providence. It was just unbelievable. This would be like Grove City high school softball team, beating the Yankees or the Dodgers, right? I mean, nothing against the Grove City high school softball team, right? But this was really just an extraordinary upset. He became his countrymen's choice not only for military general, but also to be the nation's first president. And he should be known not just for his brawn, his power, his sword, right? But also for his brain. He really understood what he referred to as the great experiment, as he and the other founders put it, that they believed was being entrusted to them, to the American people. So this was a great experiment in whether mankind was capable of self-governance. And one thing Washington said, he said this in his inaugural address and his farewell address. He said, you need a moral and religious nation so you could have people who self-govern themselves before you can have a self-governing nation, right? Think of John Adams' statement that the Constitution of the United States is made for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate for the government of any other type. So you need not just freedom, but faith, right? Or as we order it, faith and freedom at the Institute for Faith and Freedom. He also spoke of the providential character of the American Revolution. He saw it as a providential event for all the world to watch to see whether man was capable of free and democratic government. And this was, as Joe LeConte said, very much the opposite of the French Revolution. Paul Johnson, who was quoted earlier, said the difference between the French Revolution and the American Revolution is that the French Revolution was an anti-religious event. The American Revolution was a religious event. Washington was so beloved by his countrymen, even revered, that they wanted him to become king. They wanted him to become king. But here's where the brain part comes in addition to the brawn. He said, no, that's not what this was about. We didn't go through all of this so the country could get another king. Right? This is about whether people, that great experiment, that providential event, the providential character of whether people can govern themselves. So he served how many terms? Two. 1789 to 1797, establishing a precedent of a two-term presidency. Until, who blew it up, Michael? Good old FDR. I went on a diatribe against FDR to Michael on the way over here. Just unbelievable, just blew right through that. So we didn't have a two-term limit on the presidency until the 25th Amendment, which comes after FDR. Yeah. 22nd Amendment. 22nd Amendment. And prior to that, the precedent had been established by Washington that you simply serve two terms, and then what do? You retire to your Mount Vernon. Gordon Wood, who was one of the great, still is, historians of the American Revolution, said that at that point, Washington returned his commission. He returned his sword to Congress. This overture electrified not only the country, but the world. Most such military heroes expected in return some type of significant political reward commensurate with their military achievement, but not Washington. And his selfless actions, said Wood, captivated the world. Richard Norton Smith, presidential historian, said, quote, Washington could have been king. Congress, in effect, offered him a crown. He spurned it. And in the process, and I love this quote, Washington gave us a whole new definition of greatness, and that is the renunciation of power rather than the embrace of it. It was no accident that on his deathbed, Napoleon said, they wanted me to be another Washington. But alas, I was not, right? And no, he most certainly wasn't. Okay, so that said, the father of our country, of who I'm raving about, saying all these great things about his character and everything else, and Matt Spalding, who's speaking at 5:15 at dinner tonight, has written a book on the making of the Declaration of Independence, but he is the expert on George Washington, so you might want to ask Matt some questions about Washington as well. But the chink in the armor was that he owned slaves. So when he retired back to his Mount Vernon, and Mount Vernon is, how many people have been there? Yeah, wow. Okay, look at that. That's amazing. Okay, that's only at Grove City College, right? That's great. That's really great. It's about a 15-mile drive from Northern Virginia, D.C., right, down along the Potomac River. Congress to this day has protected in perpetuity the view from his back porch of the Potomac. You're not allowed to build anything over on the other side of the Potomac. It was 8,162 acres, about 500 of which are preserved today. By the way, 8,100 acres there today would be worth a lot of money. And that's ironic because Washington, as I will say, one of the reasons that he had slaves was because he was broke. He never had money. He was broke all the time. And he felt that without slave labor, he couldn't continue his farm, right? The guy started selling. You can read ads where the former president is begging timber, guys to come and cut timber from his property so he can sell some timber to try to make a buck. He traversed about 10 miles of riverfront along the Potomac. Roughly 3,200 acres of the property was under cultivation, much of it wheat. So the nation's first president was a wheat farmer until his death. In order to maintain this farm and property, Washington relied on a mass of 316 slaves altogether, 143 of which were in his possession entirely. All right, now that said, while this tore at his wallet, right, and he was doing this because he felt he had to, he inherited the farm, he planned to eventually pass it on to his brother as well. It tore at his conscience as well because he knew that slavery was wrong. Here are just some of his letters. This one to the Marquis de Lafayette, and this is April 5th, 1785. And he says here about Lafayette desiring to end slavery, "The scheme, my dear Marquis, which you propose as a precedent to encourage the emancipation of the black people of this country from that state of bondage in which they are held, is a striking evidence of the benevolence of your heart. I shall be happy to join you in so laudable a work." Happy to join you in that laudable work of emancipating the black people of this country. Writing to Lafayette a year later, May 10th, 1786, he marveled at a recent move by the Frenchman to buy a property to explicitly set free its slaves. He said, "Your late purchase of an estate in the colony of Cayenne with a view to emancipating the slave son on it is a generous and noble proof of your humanity. Would to God a like spirit would diffuse itself generally into the minds of the people of this country, but I despair of seeing it." Other letters. April 12, 1786, letter to Robert Morris, Pennsylvania, right? Robert Morris University. Some of you came in on the plane, right? Moon Township, Robert Morris University, right down the road. He said of slavery, "There is not a man who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of it." Writing to Lawrence Lewis, "I am principled against the kind of traffic in the human species." And he was especially appalled at the idea by many slave owners of breaking up families of slaves. "And to disperse the families, I have a special aversion." He found that particularly appalling, that would happen. If you've been to Mount Vernon, have you seen the slave quarters? They were built large enough in order to keep families intact. So in a way, you look at it, you're like, wow, look at those massive slave quarters. But also, at the very least, he didn't want to break the families up because he thought that was even crueler to do that. So he wanted to at least keep the families together. So they were built to accommodate full families. In another letter to Robert Lewis, 1799, I am principled, I guess I just read that one, right? I did, okay. I skipped the one to Lawrence Lewis, August 1797. "I wish from my soul that the legislature of this state could see a policy of the gradual abolition of slavery." He himself couldn't do it. And a lot of these founders felt that if someone else could just do this for us, right? He felt in the meantime he couldn't set them free, couldn't afford to do it, if someone else could do it for him, right? Now, he did propose during the American Revolution that black Americans that served on the side of the American Revolution would be freed as a result of that. Washington also set up endowments for all of his slaves and set them free at the time of his death. So he died in 1799. These endowments were so generous that one slave was still collecting on the endowment 36 years later in 1835. Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, President of the United States, 2 terms, 1801 to 1809, slave owner, and very much felt the same way. He lamented, quote, "We have the wolf by the ears, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is on one scale and self-preservation in the other." So a lot of people say today, the founders were such hypocrites. And I'll say, well, they kind of knew that they were, right? Said, yeah, this is an injustice. But on one hand, right, justice on one hand, self-preservation on the other. What am I doing? What is Washington doing? We're engaging in self-preservation. Are we being selfish? Yes, we are. Nothing is more certainly written in the book of fate than that these people are to be free. It was a moral reproach to us that they should have pleaded it so long in vain. Jefferson's 1787 notes on the state of Virginia. "Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. I think a change already perceptible since the origin of the present revolution." This is the guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence, right? The phrase, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. That phrase is entirely his. This is 11 years later. "The spirit of the master is abating, that of the slave rising from the dust, his condition mollifying, the way I hope preparing under the auspices of heaven for a total emancipation." That was the goal. So like Washington, had slaves, but himself was personally against it. More from Jefferson. In his first term in the Virginia House of Burgesses, this man who personally owned 200 slaves proposed legislation to emancipate slaves in Virginia. The motion was firmly defeated. His 1774 draft instructions to the Virginia delegates to the First Continental Congress explicitly called for an end to the slave trade. His draft constitution for the Commonwealth of Virginia forbade the importation of slaves. In 1784 in Congress, he proposed a law that would have banished slavery from the entire Western territory of the new United States after the year 1800. It failed by just one vote. As president in 1807, he urged Congress to, quote, "withdraw the citizens of the United States from all further participation in those violations of human rights which have been so long continued on the unoffending inhabitants of Africa." That would have officially ended America's participation in the slave trade. So a slave owner proposed that repeatedly, was against it morally, and actually tried to stop it politically. Historian David Tucker said this of Jefferson. Jefferson wrote a law to end slavery in Virginia. It wasn't enacted, but he had no reason to do that if he didn't believe in the principles of the Declaration. People say all the time, what hypocrites? They said life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. They believed in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and they knew that they weren't extending it to black Americans, and they knew that that was hypocrisy. Okay, but anyone who tries to diminish the importance of the Declaration of Independence is undermining the fight against racism. Without 1776, no other date in the history of slavery in America would matter. Prior to 1776, no government had announced a commitment to human equality and justice for all. So they establish in principle the idea, although they can't yet enact it. for all Americans, but attempts are being made. James Madison, father of the Constitution, father of the Bill of Rights, America's fourth president, 1809 to 17. He served 2 terms too and then retired. Not broken until FDR. Did I say that earlier? Inherited and owned slaves at Montpelier. And yet he likewise opposed what he called, opposed the practice of slavery in principle, calling it, quote, the most oppressive dominion ever exercised by man over man. He gets it. He knows it's wrong. Don't ever let anyone tell you, and they did it and they thought it was right. No, they didn't. They did it, some of them. They didn't think it was right. Okay, founders who didn't own slaves. A lot of them. Ben Franklin, our boy from Pennsylvania. He headed the Pennsylvania Society for the Abolition of Slavery. He said in November 1789, by the way, who were the 2 people who picked Jefferson to write the Declaration? Ben Franklin and John Adams. He said that slavery is such an atrocious debasement of human nature, demanded its very extirpation. February 1790, petition to the U.S. House and Senate. He urged they, quote, devise means for removing this inconsistency from the character of the American people, because it's inconsistent with the principles of the Declaration. That you will promote mercy and justice toward this distressed race, and you will step to the very verge of the powers vested in you for discouraging every species of traffic in the persons of our fellow men. You'll hear people say, they didn't even think that they were human beings. No, they did. They all did, even the ones who owned slaves. Of his fellow men who had been degraded into perpetual bondage, who were groaning in servile subjection, they were, he insisted, formed by the same almighty being. Alexander Hamilton said that too. John Adams. From which state? Massachusetts. Every measure of prudence, therefore, ought to be assumed for the eventual total extirpation of slavery from the United States. I have, throughout my life, held the practice of slavery in abhorrence. He opposed the practice throughout his life as what he called a, quote, foul contagion in the human character and an evil of colossal magnitude. Now that's a statement. These people were smart and literate, right? They didn't just, go online and right? I mean, when this guy wrote that something was evil of colossal magnitude, he was really thinking about it. Numerous letters between him and Abigail on slavery that are just incredible. Read David McCullough's book. David McCullough, Pittsburgh native, right? Wrote the book on the Johnstown flood, on Thomas Jefferson, on Harry Truman, a number of great books. Historian Thomas G. West said this: every leading founder, you might want to take a picture of that slide, acknowledged that slavery was wrong. You got that? Every leading founder acknowledged slavery was wrong. Many, of course, accepted it for their own selfish interest. All of the founders, said West, even those who defended slavery, knew well that blacks were human beings. Hardly anyone claimed that slavery was right in principle. Each of the leading founders acknowledged its wrongness. All the leading founders affirmed on many occasions that blacks are equal to whites and that slavery is wrong. And there's the Hamilton quote. Blacks were men by the laws of God and nature. And that's the line from what? The Declaration, right? The laws of nature and nature's God, as Jefferson put it. Regardless, the laws of certain states given ownership in the service of Negroes as personal property. Most important, adds West, and this is the key, the ground for the eventual total abolition of slavery was laid in the establishment of the equality principle at the center of the American polity, created by Jefferson and Madison, Franklin, Hamilton, Adams, Washington, and other leading founders. That's exactly right. John Jay, first U.S. Supreme Court Justice, first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He's been called America's Wilberforce. Who was Wilberforce? British abolitionist, right? In 1785, he organized and became the first president of the New York Manumission Society. That March, he wrote to Philadelphia's who, Joe LeConte? Where's Joe? Benjamin Rush. I wish to see all just and unnecessary discriminations everywhere abolished, and that the time may soon come when all inhabitants of every color and denomination shall be free and equal partners in our political liberty. He was also one of the three authors of which key documents arguing for the Federalist Papers? John Jay, who else? Hamilton and Madison. Benjamin Rush. There's your boy, Joe. Right? Look at this. Slavery is a hydra sin and includes in it every violation of the precepts of the law and gospel. As for those who dare attempt to vindicate the traffic and buying and selling of slaves, to sanctify their crimes by attempting to reconcile it to the sublime and perfect religion of the great author of salvation, they ought to seek out some other type of religion, given that it has no place in Christianity. Clergy must rally to put a stop to slavery. If they do not, God shall cease to be just or merciful. There's a great letter from Abigail Adams when she's talking about the period in Philadelphia when cats are dying everywhere, right? And there's this disease, and she wonders if this isn't God's punishment upon the Americans for the sin of slavery, right? As for his countrymen supporting the importation of slaves, Dr. Rush said, "Let such of our countrymen as engage in the slave trade be shunned as the greatest enemies of our country." Really powerful. Okay, actual acts to end slavery in America prior to the Emancipation Proclamation. Professor West, official actions aiming at the abolition of slavery began in 1774. Before independence was declared. The growth of slavery was quickly limited by reducing or abolishing the slave trade. Delegates to the First Continental Congress in 1774 pledged to stop the importation of slaves into America. By 1798, did you know this? Every state had outlawed slave importation. South Carolina renewed the slave trade in 1803, but Congress abolished the trade altogether in 1808. During the founding era, says West, 8 states proceeded to abolish slavery, either gradually or immediately. It's all before the Civil War. The first state to forbid slavery outright in its constitution, Vermont. 1777. Thereafter, Massachusetts, New Hampshire. Pennsylvania in 1780 had the first legislation that was passed for gradual emancipation. Then Rhode Island and Connecticut following 1783, 1784. New York and New Jersey, 1799 and 1804. All before the Civil War. But to end it entirely, you would need the Civil War. And here's our guy, Lincoln. So he says, where in Pennsylvania? Gettysburg, 1863. 7 years ago. How many years is that? 87. This goes back to 1776. Our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation conceived in liberty, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. Do you know about this speech? February 1861, Independence Hall, Philadelphia. It's a great one. Most people know Gettysburg. They don't know this one. Gave this during his inaugural journey on the way to Washington, D.C. He said that the Declaration, quote, gave liberty not alone to the people of this country, but hope to all the world for all future time. This is what motivated him politically. He said, this is the sentiment in the Declaration of Independence. I would rather die than surrender it. And he did die for it, as did 600,000 boys in the Civil War. Michael, you said to me recently, the latest research is it's closer to 700,000 that have died. More Americans died in the Civil War than all wars in the history of the country combined. World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Gulf War, War of 1812, American Revolution, all of them combined. All right, Thomas Sowell is so good on this. It is astonishing to an American today to learn that not until the 18th century, and then it was an issue only in Western civilization, that did a nation's political leaders turn against slavery. You could research all of the 18th century Africa or Asia or the Middle East without finding any comparable rejection of slavery there. I quote in my book this wild letter from the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire to the Pope. And the Sultan's like, I don't understand what you object to. You conquer a territory and you take the women and you take the people as slaves and they become booty and what is this, right? What all this moral hand-wringing stuff? This is the way it's always been done, right? Read your Old Testament. What are you talking about, you people? But who is singled out for scathing criticism today? American leaders of the 18th century. All right, what's he talking about there? America versus other contemporary countries. It's impossible to say how many people worldwide have been subjected to slavery in history, but it's probably about 10 to 20 million. Okay? All right, look at these numbers. The vast majority of those were obviously not in America. The seminal work on the subject is Hugh Thomas's book, The Slave Trade, the story of the Atlantic slave trade from 1444 to 1870. Yeah, take pictures. You get this? He said that America received less than 5% of the total 11 million slaves that were transported. To be exact, 11,328,000 slaves altogether. Of these, British North America and the U.S. had about 500,000 slaves delivered. So about 4.4% of the whole slave trade. By the way, I'm not excusing it, right? But the way it makes it sound, it was like America alone with all the slaves, right? 4.4. Which country was the greatest slave-owning country? Brazil. 4 million. 4 million. They didn't end until 1888. Spanish Empire, 2.5 million. British West Indies, 2 million. French West Indies, 1.6 million. Countries and empires that were the largest carriers of slaves, Little Portugal, 4.65 million. Britain, 2.6. Spain, 1.6. France, there's those French again, Joe. 1.25 million. This is consistent with the numbers of other scholars. Stephen Mintz says of the 10 to 16 million Africans who survived the voyage to the New World, over 1/3 landed in Brazil. Between 60 to 70% ended up in Brazil or other sugar colonies of the Caribbean. Only 6% arrived in what is the United States. So Sowell's point is, and by the way, Sowell's point is to actually try to make people feel better. Like, you weren't uniquely persecuted here, right? It's happened all over the place, right? It's actually been worse in other places. I'll quote him again in a minute. The worst slavers in history have been the Muslims. And I'm not going to quote the Quran in here, but you could buy my book. And they talk about taking booty from slaves, and you are allowed up to 4 wives, but that doesn't count concubines and slave girls taken as booty in battle, right? Muhammad had all kinds of female slaves. Slavery raged among the Aztecs, the Mayans, and the Incans, as did child sacrifice, ritualistic child killing. And of course, the Jewish people were always enslaved. Read the Old Testament all the time. American Indians. If you Google Paul Kengor, the American Spectator, Indian slavers, you can read some of my articles on this. The 5 so-called civilized tribes, Cherokee, Chickasaw, Iroquois, were the other 2, Seminole, they all had slaves. And a number of the American Indian tribes fought with the Confederacy in the Civil War, and they refused to obey the Emancipation Proclamation. Look up Chief Stand Watie, brutal slave master. There are lawsuits to this day among Black Americans who are ancestors still trying to sue Indian tribes to get restitution for what happened to their people by American Indians. Ohio State professor Robert Davis is author of the book Christian Slaves, Muslim Masters, White Slavery in the Mediterranean, Barbary Coast, in Italy from 1500 to 1800. He calculates 1.25 million white European Christians were captured and enslaved by the Muslims of the Barbary Coast between 1530 and 1780. That's where my family's from. You wouldn't know that from my dad's Polish last name, but my mom's Italian, from Calabria. That whole area for hundreds of years were constantly under threat of the Muslims coming in and enslaving their people, taking the young boys and turning them into janissaries, taking the young girls back and turning them into sex slaves. They were stopped by the Knights of Malta, by the Battle of Lepanto. Just incredible. Says Davis, one of the things that both the public and many scholars have tended to take as a given is that slavery was always racial in nature, that only blacks had been slaves. But that is not true. We cannot think of slavery as something that only white people did to black people. Enslavement was a very real possibility for anyone who traveled in the Mediterranean. By the way, some of the earliest slaves brought to America were indentured servants who came in from Britain and England. There's a whole book on that as well. I should cite that. If you lived along the shores of Italy, France, Spain, Portugal, even as far north as England and Iceland, this was a threat. St. Patrick was a slave. From the period of 1500 to 1650, when the transatlantic slave trade was in its infancy, more white Christian slaves were probably taken to Barbary than black African slaves to the Americas during that period. So this sucked for everybody. All right, wrapping this up, just a couple more slides. Thomas Sowell said, slavery was a worldwide institution for thousands of years. People of every race and color were enslaved and enslaved others. White people were still being bought and sold as slaves in the Ottoman Empire, decades after black Americans were freed. Everyone hated the idea of being a slave, but few had any qualms about enslaving others. Mention slavery and immediately the image that arises is that of Africans and their descendants, enslaved by Europeans and their descendants in the southern United States. This is a good point. No other historic horror, and slavery is a horror, including what happened to black Americans in America, obviously, right? But no other historic horror is so narrowly construed. No one so narrowly thinks of famine and epidemics and warfare. These are all afflictions that have been suffered by the entire human race all over the planet, and so is slavery. Slavery is of such a magnitude that it has existed since the beginning of recorded time on all continents. But here we go, here's the wrap up. The one civilization to fight to end it was Western civilization. Western Europe, Britain, and America first, Wilberforce, the American Civil War, and yet here in the West today, white Christians seem uniquely condemned for it, usually almost always by white liberals, who are looking to castigate and condemn the American founding and its principles. Soule says, deciding that slavery was wrong was much easier than deciding what to do with millions of people who were already enslaved. And the answer was a civil war that cost over 600,000 lives. A war in which one life was lost for every 6 people freed. Maybe that was the only answer, but don't pretend that it was an easy answer, or that those who grappled with the dilemma in the 18th century were some special villains, when most leaders and most people around the world saw nothing wrong with slavery and didn't see anything wrong with it, by the way, for another 100 years in some of these places. So he celebrates America for actually doing something about it and fighting its bloodiest war in history to do something about it. So I'm going to wrap up on this. It is our original sin in America, but it's an unoriginal sin, right? It's an evil, an awful stain, and it's definitely a dark mark on American history, but it wasn't original to America. And kudos to the founders for at least establishing in principle the right, the ability to be able to the ideas of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We could talk more about this in the Q&A if we're not out of time already. I probably went past my time. But one of the main reasons why we couldn't do in 1776 what we did in the 1860s is the southern states wouldn't have agreed to it. So we needed at first to get a Declaration of Independence, preferably unanimous, right, from the Brits, fight that battle first, right, and get that principle of the Declaration of Independence established. And then at that point, I know it's bad. We couldn't set slaves free at that point, but we just couldn't. The way history works, these things take time. And so 7 years later, we did it, but not without a huge amount of blood and sacrifice. Not without our bloodshed, Lincoln in a Civil War. So we paid the price for freedom and justice for all with that. All right, thank you. I'll take any questions that you have.
We have time for like one quick question. So that was the first hand I saw over there.
Okay. If you make them quick, I'll do 2.
What do you think pro-life activists today can learn from abolition activists back then?
Yeah, Ronald Reagan said that in a speech to the national religious broadcasters, and the New York Times went nuts. But he said that he thinks that the dehumanization of the child in the womb is similar to what was done to black Americans, and it was indeed, right? I'd even talk about the Dred Scott case that came 100 years later, almost after this, which declared that black Americans weren't like fully human or fully human beings, right? Weren't full Americans. And Reagan said that it was that same degrading and dehumanizing of the black person that happens to the child in the womb. And that's what allows other people with power to grade it and try to control it and even kill it. Yeah, so in that sense, I think it's a very good analogy. Yeah, Dan, question?
Well, don't you agree that in countries where one of your favorite subjects, where dominating communist influences is a form of slavery? In other words, if you live in total fear, you're not free. You're being intimidated. You don't know what your rights are. We're talking about freedom in this conference. You don't have the freedom.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Is that not a form of slavery?
Yeah, Martin Malya, editor of the Black Book of Communism, said that the communists not only confiscated your private property, right? The government took your private property and made it their own, but even nationalized the person, right? The person became the property of the state. And once the person was the property of the state and owned by the state felt they could dispose of that person at will. They could put that person, cart them off to Siberia. They could put them in the gulag. They could even eliminate that life if they wanted to. So, yeah, in much the same way. Yeah. I think that's a fair point. I guess I have to stop. All right, okay. Thank you.